The officer slid a photograph across the desk, turned it so I could see it clearly, and asked, in a voice far too calm for what the picture showed, "Do you recognize this man?" I looked down at my own husband's face, walking through an airport arrivals hall in Paris, his arm wrapped easily around a woman I had never seen before in my life, and I remember thinking, quite absurdly, that his shirt in the photo was one I did not own, one I had never seen hanging in our closet at home. My name is Elena Marsh. I am 33 years old. I work as an interior designer in a quiet town called Fenmore, and until that afternoon, sitting in a plastic chair inside a government office that smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee, I believed my marriage, whatever its quiet difficulties, was at the very least honest. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened to me, which means I am not going to start at the very beginning. I am going to start exactly where I was sitting when everything I believed about my life quietly, permanently cracked open. We were there, my husband Adrian and I, for what should have been an entirely unremarkable appointment. We were preparing to relocate for his work, and the process required us to renew and verify a joint residency document, the kind of paperwork married couples complete without a second thought, sitting side by side in uncomfortable chairs, filling out forms, waiting for a stamp that means nothing more than, "Yes, this marriage is real. Please proceed." I remember that morning clearly, perhaps because it was, up until that moment, so completely unremarkable. I had made coffee for both of us before we left, teased Adrian gently about the tie he had chosen, wondered aloud whether we should stop for lunch afterward at the small cafe near the office, the one with the good soup. He had laughed, agreed, kissed my forehead before we walked inside, an entirely ordinary gesture from an entirely ordinary morning, one I would replay countless times in the months that followed, searching it for some sign I might have missed, some flicker of guilt or hesitation that simply was not there. Officer Callum Reyes had called us in separately, which I remember finding strange at the time, though I assumed it was simply procedure, a formality neither Adrian nor I questioned. Adrian went in first. I sat outside, scrolling through my phone, thinking about a client's kitchen renovation, about paint samples and cabinet hardware, about nothing more complicated than the small, pleasant concerns of an ordinary Tuesday. When it was my turn, Officer Reyes greeted me politely, professionally, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. He was a methodical man, the kind who chooses his words carefully, who does not rush toward difficult conversations, but does not avoid them either. He asked me a series of standard questions: how long Adrian and I had been married, where we currently lived, the nature of Adrian's employment. I answered easily, comfortably, the way you answer questions about a life you have never had reason to doubt. And then he opened a thin folder on his desk, removed a single photograph, and slid it toward me. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked. I looked down, and for a strange, suspended moment, my mind simply refused to process what I was seeing, the way your mind sometimes refuses to process something too large to fit inside an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It was Adrian, unmistakably Adrian, walking through an airport arrivals hall, a small suitcase in one hand, his other arm wrapped comfortably around a woman with dark hair and a warm, familiar smile. The kind of smile you only give someone you know intimately, someone you have walked beside 100 times before. "That's my husband," I said slowly, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "Why are you showing me this?" Officer Reyes studied my face for a long moment, the way you study someone when you are trying to determine how much they already understand, how much you will need to explain. "This photograph," he said carefully, "was taken at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris 4 months ago. According to French residency records, the woman beside your husband is listed as his spouse." I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, confused sound, because the sentence simply did not fit into any version of reality I currently occupied. "That's impossible," I said. "I'm his spouse. We've been married 5 years. He was working late that week. He's been working late for the past 8 months. There's no way." I stopped speaking, because something in Officer Reyes's expression told me, before he said another word, that he was not confused, that he was not making a mistake, that whatever he was about to tell me next was going to be far more complicated than a simple administrative error. If you are watching this, I want you to imagine, for a moment, being shown proof of something impossible, something that contradicts every single thing you believe to be true about the person you built your life around. Not a rumor, not a suspicion. A photograph, dated, time-stamped, sitting on a government official's desk, showing your husband's arm around a woman filed, legally, as his wife. I did not know it yet, sitting in that plastic chair, but the appointment I had walked into that morning was never routine at all. To understand how I ended up in that chair, staring at a photograph that made no sense, I need to take you back 8 months, to the beginning of what Adrian called his busy season, a phrase he used so often during those months that I eventually stopped questioning it, the way you stop questioning a phrase you hear repeated enough times. It started small, the way these things always seem to, at least looking back on them afterward. A late night here, a missed dinner there, always accompanied by an apologetic phone call, always framed around a promotion he had recently received, more responsibility, more demanding clients, more travel required for what he described as regional oversight, a phrase vague enough to cover almost anything, specific enough to sound legitimate. I remember our fifth wedding anniversary, 6 months into his busy season, a date I had circled on our kitchen calendar for weeks, a small reservation made at the restaurant where he had proposed. He canceled 2 hours before, apologetic, stressed, explaining a client emergency that could not wait, promising we would celebrate properly once things settled down. I remember sitting alone at our kitchen table that evening, eating leftover pasta, telling myself that ambition sometimes required sacrifice, that a strong marriage could withstand a difficult season, that Adrian's absence was simply the cost of the life we were building together. I remember, too, the small rituals I built around his absences without fully realizing I was building them. I started leaving his dinner covered on the stove, a note beside it telling him to heat it whenever he got home, a habit that felt loving at the time, though I understand now it was also a quiet way of avoiding the growing silence of eating alone every evening. I began watching entire seasons of shows we had once watched together, alone, telling myself I was simply staying entertained, not admitting how much I missed the particular comfort of his presence on the other end of the couch. I filled the loneliness of those months carefully, quietly, the way people do when they do not yet understand they are filling a loneliness at all. I threw myself into my design work, took on 2 new clients, spent long evenings sketching floor plans and selecting fabric swatches, telling myself I was simply staying productive while Adrian worked toward our future. I spent more time in my garden that year than I had in the previous 3 combined, finding a strange comfort in the predictable rhythm of watering, weeding, watching small green things grow steadily under my care, requiring nothing from me except attention and patience. My sister visited often during those months, and I remember her asking me once, gently, over coffee in my kitchen, whether Adrian's schedule concerned me. I remember defending him almost automatically, telling her that his job simply demanded more right now, that this was temporary, that I trusted him completely. She did not push further, though I remember now a small flicker of something in her expression, something close to worry, something I chose not to examine too closely at the time. I want to ask you something, because I think many of you watching this have experienced some version of it yourselves. Have you ever mistaken someone's absence for ambition when it was, in reality, something else entirely, something you simply were not ready to name? I filled 8 months with careful, generous explanations for Adrian's distance, never once considering that the explanation I needed might have been sitting somewhere else entirely, somewhere I had not thought to look. There were small moments, scattered throughout those 8 months, that I now understand were warnings I simply did not recognize as warnings at the time. A new cologne I did not recognize, worn only after certain trips. A slight tan that appeared and faded on a schedule that never quite matched the gray, overcast business trips he described. A period, roughly 4 months into his busy season, when he seemed unusually distracted, quieter than usual, before settling back into his familiar rhythm within a week or two, an adjustment I attributed to work stress rather than anything more complicated. I remember, too, a strange evening roughly midway through those 8 months, when Adrian came home later than usual, his phone ringing just as he stepped through the door, a call he answered quickly, stepping into the hallway to take it, his voice dropping to something low and careful I could not quite make out through the closed door. When he returned, he explained it as a work colleague dealing with a personal crisis, and I remember feeling only mild curiosity, nothing close to suspicion, accepting the explanation the way I had accepted so many others throughout those months. I also remember, though I did not understand its significance until much later, a small charge on our shared credit card statement for a florist in an unfamiliar city, an amount I noticed only briefly before Adrian explained it as a gift sent to a colleague's retirement party, an explanation I accepted without a second thought, filing it away among the dozens of small, unremarkable details that make up any ordinary marriage. I did not know, sitting in my kitchen those quiet evenings, eating dinner alone, watering my garden, filling my hours with fabric swatches and floor plans, that somewhere else entirely, Another version of my husband was building an entirely different life, one that would eventually collide with mine in a small government office that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I need to explain, briefly, why Adrian and I found ourselves at that immigration office in the first place, because the appointment itself was, on the surface, entirely unremarkable, the kind of paperwork errand that couples complete without much thought. Adrian's company had offered him an international transfer, an opportunity he had presented to me with genuine excitement several weeks earlier, a chance to relocate together, to expand his career, to build something new, somewhere unfamiliar. I remember feeling cautiously hopeful about it, thinking that perhaps a change of scenery might restore some of the closeness his busy season had quietly worn away. We had begun the paperwork process together, submitting joint documentation, verifying our marriage for residency purposes in the country where he would soon be working. Officer Reyes explained to me, once the photograph sat between us on his desk, that his role involved reviewing exactly this kind of cross-border documentation, verifying marital status across multiple systems to prevent fraud, particularly in cases involving international relocation. As part of that process, he explained, standard facial recognition software cross-checks travel records and residency filings across partner countries, flagging inconsistencies that might otherwise go unnoticed. Your husband's travel pattern, he said carefully, showed frequent trips to Paris over the past several months, always brief, always returning within a few days. When we cross-referenced those travel dates against French residency filings, we found a marriage registration, filed under his full legal name, to a woman whose identity does not match yours. I stared at him, my mind struggling to hold the shape of what he was telling me. That's not possible, I said again, though the words felt increasingly hollow, even as I spoke them. He's been working late. He's been traveling for work, regional oversight, client meetings, he told me. I understand this is difficult to hear, Officer Reyes said gently, though without softening the facts themselves. I want to be clear that this appointment was not designed to deceive you. When the system flagged this discrepancy, I made the decision to address it directly with you, separately from your husband, because your own residency status and your legal protections moving forward depend on you understanding the full situation accurately. I asked him how long he had known before calling us in, whether he had suspected something the moment he reviewed our file, or whether the discovery had happened only that morning during Adrian's own interview. He explained that the flag had appeared in the system 3 days earlier, prompting him to review the case thoroughly before our appointment, ensuring he understood every relevant detail before choosing how and when to address it. I considered several ways to handle this, he admitted, but ultimately decided the most respectful approach was to inform you directly, factually, without unnecessary drama, and to give you the space to decide how you wanted to proceed from there. I want to ask you something here, because I think it matters. What would you do if the very system meant to formalize and protect your life together turned out to be the thing that finally exposed it was never entirely whole to begin with? I sat there, staring at that photograph, feeling the careful architecture of my marriage begin to shift beneath me, one quiet, devastating detail at a time. Where is Adrian now? I asked. Does he know you're showing me this? He's currently waiting in the reception area, Officer Reyes said. He does not yet know what we're discussing. I wanted to speak with you directly first, given the sensitivity of the situation and given your legal right to understand exactly what these records indicate about your own residency filing. I remember sitting very still after he said that, aware suddenly of Adrian only a few walls away, entirely unaware that his careful, dual life was, at that very moment, being unraveled thread by thread in a small office he could not see into. I remember wondering, briefly, what he was doing out there, whether he was checking his phone, glancing at his watch, entirely unconcerned, entirely confident that the appointment would end exactly as routinely as it had begun. Officer Reyes continued, his voice steady, methodical, the voice of a man delivering difficult information as carefully as possible. The residency filing in France, he said, indicates that your husband entered into a civil marriage there under standard spousal provisions. That marriage required him to submit employment documentation, proof of residence, and a marital status declaration confirming he was not currently married elsewhere. But he is married elsewhere, I said. He's married to me. Yes, Officer Reyes said quietly, which means the declaration filed in France appears to have been falsified, either through omission or through fraudulent documentation, in order to complete that marriage registration. I asked him, my voice unsteady, how something like this could even be possible, how a man could maintain two entirely separate legal marriages without either system catching the discrepancy sooner. He explained patiently that cross-border verification systems had only recently been updated to include the kind of facial recognition cross-checking that had ultimately flagged Adrian's case, that fraud of this particular kind, while rare, was not entirely unprecedented, particularly among individuals whose work required frequent, unremarkable international travel, the kind of travel that raises no immediate suspicion on its own. I sat with that for a long moment, the pieces slowly, painfully arranging themselves into a shape I did not want to look at directly. 8 months of working late, frequent brief trips to Paris, a new cologne, a slight unexplained tan, a period of distraction 4 months into his busy season. When did this marriage take place? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The one in France. When exactly? Officer Reyes glanced down at the file, his expression carefully neutral, though I could sense him weighing how much to share, how gently to deliver whatever came next. According to the registration date, he said, the civil marriage was formalized in Paris 4 months after your own wedding date. I felt the air leave my chest entirely. 4 months, not 8 months ago, when his busy season supposedly began. 4 months after our own wedding day, 5 years ago, when I had stood in a small chapel in Fenmore believing, completely, that I was building an honest life with the man standing across from me. I remember staring at my own hands in that moment, at the ring Adrian had placed there 5 years earlier, suddenly aware of it in a way I had not been in years. A small, familiar weight I had stopped noticing entirely, now suddenly, painfully present again, a symbol I no longer knew how to interpret. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know how badly you are waiting to hear what came next, the same way I sat there, waiting, my entire body braced for whatever Officer Reyes was about to reveal. Before I tell you, I want to take a small moment to speak with you directly. If this story has kept you here, wondering, the way I sat there wondering in that small office, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing to this channel. Stories like this one, honest and difficult and human, deserve to be told carefully, and having you here with me means more than you know. Thank you for staying. Now let me tell you exactly what Officer Reyes revealed next. The woman's name listed on the French residency filing, he said, is Camille Lefebvre. According to the documentation, she and your husband have been legally married under French civil law for nearly 5 years, almost the entire length of your own marriage. I sat perfectly still, staring at the photograph still resting on the desk between us, Adrian's arm around a stranger's shoulders, a stranger who had, according to a government file sitting in front of me, been his legal wife for nearly the entire time I had believed myself to be his only one. Officer Reyes explained carefully that while much of the residency file remained confidential, certain details were legally accessible to me, given that my own visa status and financial protections could be directly affected by the fraudulent filing. He provided me with an address, a location tied to the French residency registration, information he was permitted, within legal bounds, to share for my own protection moving forward. I did not confront Adrian that day, not immediately. I sat with him in the car afterward, said very little, told him only that the appointment had raised some questions I needed time to think through. I watched him carefully during that silent drive home, searching his face for some sign of the deception now sitting heavily in my chest, and I remember feeling, with a strange, quiet clarity, that I did not yet want him to know what I knew, not until I had seen the truth for myself, firsthand, rather than living inside whatever explanation he would inevitably construct once confronted. That evening, I sat alone in our bedroom while Adrian showered, staring at the small collection of photographs on our dresser, our wedding day, a trip to the coast 2 years earlier, an anniversary dinner from before his busy season began. I studied his face in each one, searching for something, some flicker of the deception I now knew he was capable of, though I found nothing, only the same warm, familiar smile I had trusted completely for 5 years. That perhaps was the most unsettling realization of all, understanding that a person capable of this kind of sustained deception could still look, in every ordinary photograph, exactly like someone worthy of complete trust. I remember lying awake beside him that night, listening to his steady, untroubled breathing, wondering how a person carrying a secret of this magnitude could sleep so easily, so completely undisturbed, while I lay rigid beside him, my mind racing through 5 years of memories, searching each one for cracks I had never noticed before. I did not sleep at all that night, and I remember watching the first gray light of morning slowly filling our bedroom curtains, understanding, with quiet certainty, that whatever happened next, I could no longer simply continue living inside the comfortable version of my life I had believed in only 3 days earlier. 3 days later, I booked a flight to Paris, alone, telling Adrian only that I needed a few days to think, that an old friend from university had invited me to visit, a lie that felt strange and uncomfortable in my mouth, though far smaller than the lie I now understood he had been living for nearly 5 years. I found the address Officer Reyes had given me, a modest apartment building in a quiet residential district, nothing like the glamorous version of Paris I had always imagined. I stood outside for a long time, gathering whatever courage remained after 3 sleepless nights, before finally climbing the stairs and knocking on the door. A woman answered, the same woman from the photograph, though seeing her in person felt entirely different from seeing her captured in a still image. She had kind eyes, tired in a way that suggested she, too, had been carrying something heavy recently, though she did not yet know how heavy it was about to become. "Can I help you?" she asked, her English careful, slightly accented. "My name is Elena," I said. "I'm looking for information about Adrian Marsh." Her expression shifted immediately, confusion sharpening into something wary, defensive. "Adrian is my husband," she said. "Who are you? Are you from his work?" "I'm his wife, too," I said quietly. "I think we need to talk." She stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her hand tightening on the frame, before finally stepping aside and letting me in, her expression somewhere between disbelief and a dawning, horrified recognition, the same recognition I imagined had settled over my own face 3 days earlier, sitting across from Officer Reyes. We sat across from each other in her small, tidy living room, and slowly, carefully, painfully, we began comparing our lives, piecing together a timeline neither of us had ever been given the full truth about. Camille told me she had met Adrian nearly 6 years ago, during what he described to her, at the time, as an extended work placement in France. They had married in a small civil ceremony 4 months after what I now understood was our own wedding, a detail that landed between us with a heaviness neither of us seemed able to fully absorb at first. "He told me he had never been married," Camille said, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me he was building a life here, that his work required him to travel back to England occasionally, but that his home, his real home, was here with me." I felt something crack open in my chest, listening to her describe an entire architecture of lies nearly identical to the one I had lived inside myself, simply built in a different country, aimed at a different woman. She showed me photographs on her phone, their small civil ceremony, a modest gathering of what she believed were his few close friends from work. People I now suspect were simply acquaintances willing to play a convenient role for an afternoon. I recognized, with a strange, sinking familiarity, small details scattered throughout the images. A watch he wore that I had given him for our third anniversary, a particular way he tilted his head when smiling for photographs, gestures, and objects that belonged, I had always believed, entirely to our life together, now revealed to have quietly traveled between two completely separate existences. "We have a daughter," Camille said quietly, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me in an entirely new way. "She's 3 years old. Adrian calls her his little treasure. He's missed birthdays, holidays, entire seasons of her childhood, always explaining it away as work obligations back in England." I sat with that revelation for a long, silent moment, understanding, with sudden and painful clarity, that this was no longer simply a story about my own broken marriage. There was a child now, a small girl somewhere in that apartment's other rooms, whose entire understanding of her father was built on the same careful architecture of lies that had shaped my own life for the past 5 years. Camille asked hesitantly whether I wanted to meet her, and I remember hesitating myself, uncertain whether it was fair to the child to become another complicated adult presence in a life already quietly upended by circumstances entirely beyond her understanding. In the end, Camille brought her out briefly, a small, curious girl with Adrian's same dark eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit, glancing shyly at the stranger sitting in her living room. I felt something enormous and complicated settle in my chest, watching her, grief for the childhood I had never had with Adrian myself, tangled together with a fierce, unexpected tenderness toward a little girl who had done absolutely nothing to deserve the confusion that was inevitably headed her way. "I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. How do you hold both grief and protectiveness at the exact same time?" Grief for the life you believed you were living, and genuine concern for a child caught entirely innocently inside someone else's carefully constructed deception. I felt both of those things simultaneously. Sitting in Camille's living room, grief for myself tangled inextricably with a fierce, unexpected protectiveness toward a little girl I had never even met before that afternoon. Camille and I spent the following hours comparing documents, dates, stories Adrian had told each of us, realizing slowly how carefully he had constructed two entirely separate lives, each one convincing enough on its own, each one built on the other's careful ignorance of what existed on the opposite side of the ocean. We compared the explanations he had given each of us for his travel schedule, noticing, with a strange mixture of horror and dark amusement, how closely the excuses mirrored each other: regional oversight, client emergencies, the same handful of vague, professional-sounding phrases stretched carefully across two entirely different households. "What happens now?" Camille asked eventually, her voice small, exhausted. "For my daughter. For me. I don't even know what my legal status is here if our marriage was never valid because he was already married to you. I want to ask you one more thing because I think about it often, even now. Would you choose to help someone your husband deceived, someone whose existence shattered your own understanding of your marriage, even if helping her cost you something further, even if it complicated your own path forward?" I did not hesitate, sitting there, offering Camille whatever support I could provide, not out of obligation, but because I understood, with sudden clarity, that we were both victims of the exact same, careful, deliberate deception, and that her daughter deserved protection regardless of the complicated circumstances surrounding her birth. We stayed up late that night, long after her daughter had been put to bed, talking quietly over tea, two women who had never chosen each other, bound together permanently by a man neither of us fully knew, discovering gradually an unexpected ease in each other's company, the particular relief of speaking honestly with someone who understood exactly, precisely what the other was carrying. Camille told me at one point that she had always felt a strange, unplaceable distance in Adrian, something she attributed, for years, to cultural differences, to the natural adjustment of building a life with someone from another country. "I thought it was simply who he was," she said quietly. "Reserved, private. I never imagined it was because half of him was always somewhere else, with someone else, living an entirely different version of himself." I told her in turn about the small rituals I had built around his absences, the covered dinners, the shows watched alone, the careful, generous explanations I had constructed for every unexplained hour. We laughed eventually, a strange, exhausted laughter that surprised us both, recognizing how thoroughly we had each, independently, constructed our own patient, loving explanations for a man who had never deserved either version of our patience. Camille and I decided together, sitting in her small living room as evening settled over the quiet Paris street outside, that we would report the fraud through proper legal channels in both countries, not out of spite or revenge, but because her residency status and her daughter's future stability depended entirely on the truth being formally, legally established. Before any of that began, though, there was one conversation neither of us could avoid. Adrian returned to Camille's apartment 2 days after my arrival, having been told only that a family matter required his presence back in Paris sooner than expected. I remember the sound of his key in the door, the small, ordinary click of a lock turning, followed by his voice calling out cheerfully in French, a language I had never once heard him speak in 5 years of marriage, a small detail that somehow stung more sharply than I expected. He stopped in the doorway the moment he saw me, his cheerful expression collapsing instantly into something between shock and dawning horror. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Though I think we both already know the answer." Camille stood beside me, her arms crossed, her expression a careful mixture of grief and cold, controlled anger. "5 years, Adrian," she said quietly. "5 years, and you never once mentioned her. You told me you'd never been married." "5 years for me too," I said, "only I didn't know I was sharing them with anyone else at all." Adrian attempted, several times, to explain, offering fragmented justifications about circumstances spiraling beyond his intention, about loving us both in different, complicated ways, about always meaning to resolve the situation eventually, once the timing felt right. I listened to each excuse dissolve the moment it left his mouth, understanding, with quiet finality, that there had never been a timing that would have made any of this acceptable, only a lifetime of careful postponement, each day adding another layer to a lie that had grown far too large to ever be honestly untangled. Do you have any idea, I asked him quietly, what it felt like, sitting across from a stranger, being shown a photograph of my own husband's arm around someone else, learning that the marriage I built my entire adult life around was only ever half of your actual life? He tried to answer, but I continued before he could. And do you have any idea what it must have felt like for Camille, believing she was your only wife, raising your daughter, believing her father's absences were simply the cost of an honest, demanding career? You didn't just deceive me, Adrian. You built an entire structure of deception sturdy enough to hold two separate families, and you did it so carefully that neither of us noticed for years. You have a daughter in the other room, I said quietly, who believes her father simply works far away, and I have 5 years of my life built around a version of you that apparently never fully existed. I don't need you to explain yourself, Adrian. I need you to understand exactly what you've done, to both of us, and to her. He had no real answer for that, standing in the doorway of an apartment that represented an entire life I had never known existed, his face pale, his earlier cheerful greeting entirely forgotten. He sat down eventually on the small sofa across from us, his shoulders sinking, the careful confidence that had carried him through years of dual deception finally, visibly, collapsing under the simple weight of two women standing together, refusing any longer to accept half-truths as complete explanations. We spent the following weeks in careful, difficult coordination, working with lawyers in both countries, providing documentation, answering questions from officials who, much like Officer Reyes, approached the situation with careful, methodical professionalism rather than judgment. Adrian's employment documentation, it turned out, had indeed been falsified in several places, forged signatures and fabricated company letters used to justify both his frequent travel and his fraudulent marital declaration in France. I will not describe every detail of what followed: the legal proceedings, the difficult conversations, the quiet unraveling of a marriage I had once believed was simply weathering a demanding professional season. Some parts of a story are better held privately, honored rather than exposed in complete detail for an audience, even a kind and understanding one. What I will tell you is this: Adrian faced serious consequences in both countries: marital fraud charges in France, related to his falsified residency documentation, alongside the obvious dissolution of both marriages once the truth became legally undeniable. His employer, once informed of the falsified travel documentation, terminated his position entirely. The regional oversight that had justified 8 months of late nights and unexplained travel revealed finally as nothing more than a carefully maintained cover story. Camille's residency status, thankfully, was protected once the fraud was formally established, her daughter's future secured through legal provisions designed exactly for situations like hers, situations where a parent's deception should never fall onto an innocent child's shoulders. Camille and I did not become enemies through any of this, despite what perhaps Adrian expected, despite what perhaps a simpler version of this story might have become. Instead, we remained in careful, respectful contact throughout the proceedings, two women who had never chosen each other, bound together permanently by a man's careful architecture of lies, finding, in that shared understanding, something honest and steady amid everything false that had brought us together in the first place. I flew home alone, my suitcase feeling far heavier than it had on the way there, though I had added nothing new to it beyond a folder of documents and a small, careful understanding of exactly how thoroughly I had been deceived. The house felt strange when I returned, filled with small reminders of a life that had, in many crucial ways, never been entirely real. I moved through our rooms slowly that first evening, looking at photographs on the walls, wedding pictures, anniversary trips, ordinary evenings captured in ordinary frames, wondering how much of what I saw had been genuine affection, and how much had simply been careful performance, maintained skillfully across an ocean, across two separate lives running quietly in parallel. I did not sleep well for many nights afterward, moving instead through the house at odd hours, touching small objects that had once felt entirely ordinary: his reading glasses left on the nightstand, a jacket still hanging in the hall closet, a coffee mug he always used, now sitting untouched in the cabinet. Each object felt strange in my hands, evidence of a life I had shared unknowingly with a stranger wearing a familiar face. I remember one particularly difficult night, sitting on the kitchen floor at nearly 3 in the morning, surrounded by every photograph I owned of Adrian, sorting them slowly into piles, not out of any practical necessity, but simply because I needed, physically, to hold and examine each piece of evidence of a marriage I no longer fully understood. I did not cry that night, not exactly. I simply sat, quietly, looking at each image, searching for something I never quite found. Some visible seam where the honest man I believed I married ended and the deceptive stranger apparently began. There was no seam. That, I think, was the hardest part to accept. Understanding that deception this complete leaves no visible trace at all. Not in a smile, not in a gesture, not in the particular way someone holds your hand across a dinner table. I want to leave you with something important here, because I think it matters more than any single detail of what happened afterward. When someone shows you who they truly are, not through their words, but through the careful paperwork of their lies, will you believe the comfortable story they continue to tell you, or will you believe the evidence sitting plainly in front of you? I chose the evidence, difficult as that choice was, and I have never once regretted choosing clarity over comfortable denial. I began, slowly, deliberately, rebuilding my design business around a renewed sense of purpose, taking on projects that genuinely excited me rather than simply filling lonely hours. I returned to my garden with fresh appreciation, understanding now, perhaps more deeply than before, the particular comfort of tending something that answers honestly to care and attention without any hidden complications beneath its surface. I spoke with a therapist regularly during those first difficult months, someone who helped me understand that the doubts I had quietly dismissed throughout Adrian's busy season were not evidence of my own foolishness, but simply evidence of trust extended generously to someone who had spent years carefully engineering that trust to conceal an entirely separate life. She asked me once during an early session whether I blamed myself for not noticing sooner, and I remember answering honestly that some part of me still did, even knowing, rationally, how carefully and deliberately Adrian had constructed each explanation, each excuse, each small deflection designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of suspicion I might otherwise have developed. She reminded me gently that deception this sustained, this carefully engineered, says everything about the person capable of maintaining it, and nothing at all about the person generous enough to believe it. My sister sat with me through many of those early difficult evenings, bringing takeout, sitting quietly while I processed one difficult realization after another, never once saying, "I told you so," despite having every reason to, given her quiet concern all those months earlier. I remember thanking her for that restraint once, and she simply took my hand and told me that watching someone you love discover a painful truth is never an occasion for anything except gentleness. I still hear from Camille occasionally, brief messages checking in on each other, two women navigating separate recoveries in separate countries, bound by an experience neither of us would have chosen, yet grateful, in a strange and quiet way, to have faced the truth of it together rather than in complete isolation. She sent me a photograph recently of her daughter's fourth birthday, a small happy celebration surrounded by friends and family, no longer built around a father's careful absences and half-explained travel schedules, but around people who show up honestly, consistently, without hidden complications. I think about Officer Reyes often, the methodical stranger who chose to address a difficult truth directly rather than allowing me to walk forward blindly into a relocation built on fraudulent foundations. I never fully thanked him for the careful, professional way he handled an enormously difficult conversation, though I did send a formal letter afterward, expressing my gratitude for his honesty, for choosing clarity over comfortable silence. If this story has moved you the way living through it moved me, thank you sincerely for staying with me until the end. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue sharing honest human stories like this one together. I am not the same woman who sat in that plastic chair, confused by a photograph that made no sense. I am someone steadier now, someone who has learned that the truth, even when it arrives as a photograph slid quietly across a government desk, is always kinder in the end than 8 months or 5 years spent inside a carefully maintained lie. It has been nearly a year now since that appointment, and I still think often about that photograph, Adrian's arm around Camille's shoulders, both of them smiling easily in an airport arrivals hall captured by a security camera. Neither of them knew was documenting the exact moment their carefully separated lives would eventually collide with mine. For a long time afterward, I thought of that photograph as the moment my life fell apart, the single image that shattered 5 years of careful, comfortable belief. I have come to understand it differently now, with the particular clarity that only distance and time can provide. That photograph was not the moment my life fell apart. It was the moment my life finally became true. The moment years of careful, hidden fiction were finally, undeniably replaced by something real. However painful that reality initially felt to hold. I rebuilt my design business steadily throughout that year, taking on larger, more ambitious projects, discovering a confidence in my own judgment that I had not fully recognized before, perhaps because I had spent so many quiet years deferring, gently and unconsciously, to a marriage built on foundations I never had the chance to properly examine. I redesigned my own home last spring, room by room, choosing colors and textures that reflected exactly what I wanted, without needing to consider anyone else's preferences, anyone else's schedule, anyone else's careful, hidden absences. I took on a large commercial project early this year, redesigning a small boutique hotel on the edge of Fenmore, work that required long hours and careful attention, work that reminded me, gradually, how capable I truly was, independent of any marriage, any partnership, any external validation. Standing in that finished hotel lobby last month, watching guests move through a space I had shaped entirely with my own vision, I felt something I had not felt in years, a quiet, steady pride that belonged entirely to me. My sister visits often now, and we laugh sometimes about that early conversation over coffee in my kitchen, when she gently asked whether Adrian's schedule concerned me, and I defended him almost automatically. She tells me she never wanted to be right about her quiet worry, that she takes no satisfaction in it, only relief that I eventually found my way to a clearer, steadier version of my own life. I have started, tentatively, to imagine what comes next for me, not rushing toward anything, simply allowing myself to consider a future built more carefully this time, grounded in honesty rather than convenient assumptions. I have learned this past year that trust is not something to abandon entirely after being betrayed, but something to extend more thoughtfully, with clearer eyes, with a willingness to notice the small inconsistencies I once explained away so generously. A close friend asked me recently whether I still believed in marriage at all after everything that happened. I thought about the question carefully before answering. I told her that I still believed in the idea of it. Two people choosing honesty with each other, day after day, deliberately, rather than simply assuming it exists because a ring was exchanged once, years earlier. I told her that what I no longer believed in was blind faith extended without ever checking whether it was being honored. That healthy trust, I had come to understand, requires occasional, gentle verification, not suspicion exactly, simply attentiveness. The kind I had not fully practiced during those 8 careful, quiet months of working late. Camille and her daughter visited England last month, a small tentative trip we had discussed for months beforehand, uncertain whether it would feel right until we were actually standing together in my garden, her daughter chasing butterflies between the tomato plants while Camille and I sat nearby, drinking tea, talking easily about nothing in particular, the way old friends do. It struck me, watching that little girl laugh in my garden, how strange and unexpected life's paths can be, how the very photograph that once represented the worst morning of my life had, eventually, quietly, led me toward this particular, unlikely friendship. Some journeys begin with an ordinary appointment, a routine errand completed without much thought. Mine began that way too, and ended somewhere I never expected, standing across from a stranger in Paris who understood my particular heartbreak better than anyone else possibly could. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you after this story, it is this. Sometimes the hardest truths arrive quietly, slid across a desk in a plain manila folder, and even then, even in that quiet, devastating moment, they are still the beginning of something honest, something finally, completely your own.